Israel because, of course, we saw the king come in, the nation come in and try to attack, and Asa was able to drive them out and then follow them all the way back and destroy them as people, just dead people laying everywhere, and Asa, they're able to take all the spoils and all the stuff back to the kingdom. And then we get to chapter 16 of 2 Chronicles. Okay? If we look at verse 19 of chapter 15, just above it, how it is in my Bible, it says, "And there was no more war unto the 5 and 30th year of the reign of Asa." Good. Okay? And that was a direct... the fact that things were good in the kingdom was a direct relation to what reason? Why were things good in the kingdom? Because of what reason? Because Asa's loyalty to God, right? So we had this time now where things were going good because of Asa's loyalty to God. Now we get to, as we see in chapter 16, verse 1, and in the 6th and 30th year, so just 1 year removed, right? Just the very next the reign of Asa, Baasha, king of Israel, came up against Judah and built the king of Judah. And as began his reign as king very wisely. Okay? But much like his great-grandfather, Asa's great-grandfather have been King Solomon. Okay? So much like King Solomon, his great-grandfather, he ended his reign as king rather foolishly. Having experienced victory over the Ethiopians, by trusting in the Lord, and by trusting in God, he then chose to become disloyal to God. And as we see here in the first verse, that King Baasha of Israel is going to build a fortress city here in Ramah, and that was just 5 miles north of Jerusalem. Okay, is where he sent this at. And the reason that this fortress city was being built is that King Baasha is trying to break down or to squash of all of these gods. And getting into Judah, and we're seeing this revival take place. So we have the king in the north now that's trying to get rid of this movement of these godly Israelites in Judah. Okay, Asa feels in the threat that Asa feels because of this, so he has a response to it. So verse 2, "Then Asa brought out silver and gold out of the treasures of the house of the Lord and of the king's house, and he sent it to Ben-Hadad, the king of Syria, that dwelt at Damascus, saying," verse 3, "There is a league between me and thee, as there was between my father and thy father. Behold, I have sent thee silver and gold. Go break thy league with King Baasha, with Baasha the king of Israel, that he may depart from me." All right, so Asa feels so threatened by this advance of King Baasha that he has to make a decision, and what he does is, we saw there, he goes to the king of Syria, and he's asking the king of Syria to break the treaty that they have with the nation of Israel. Okay, and breaking that treaty, of course, when we have treaties that are set up, treaties are things that say we won't fight, right? It's a time of peace, an agreement between two nations so that there won't be any type of attacking or anything going on. Asa wants the king of Syria to be broken. And he wants Syria to then invade the northern Israel cities and conquer a bunch of conquer a bunch of their cities. Look at verse 4. Okay, so Ben-Hadad then hearkened unto King Asa. So he sees what Asa has sent down and decides that he's going to listen to him. And he sends the captains of his armies against the cities of Israel, and they smote. The Syrian army comes in and invades many of the cities and very important cities in the northern kingdom. And then we get to verse 5, and when it came to pass that when Baasha heard it, that he left off building of Ramah and let his work cease. So in response to the Syrian armies coming in, the northern king abandons the project there that he's building in Ramah and ceases to work and ceases the fortifying of that city. And as verse 6 says again, then Asa the king took all of Judah, and they carried away all of the stones of Ramah. So all the working that was going on there, they carried it away, and the wood as well, it says, in the timber thereof, wherewith Baasha was building, and he built therewith at Geba and Mizpah. All right, so they quit the work there because of the influence of the Syrian army. Asa then comes in, dismantles all of the work, and used it to build up two of his own cities in Judah. The first instance here, right, we've seen the high point of Asa's life, and what we're going to essentially be doing is now seeing kind of the digression of Asa's life as well. Because he had this problem, and up to this point, every time a problem came in Asa's life, or every time a problem had happened with the kingdoms, his first response was to go to whom? To God, right? To God. Not anything that asked him for wisdom or asked him for guidance or direction, whatever it may be. Another problem has happened just a year removed now of idea of going to the king of Syria there. Now, after reading there those first six verses in this first instance here of his relying on somebody else other than God, what do you think that Asa concluded about how his plan to deal with the northern kingdom worked out? What do you think after all this is taking place? Asa is taking the stuff. Successful. Exactly, right? This worked out. Have to attack Israel, and he got all this kind of stuff in return for it as well. But as we see in verse 7, that even though his reliance on Syria and his ideas seem to have helped, we get to verse 7. Kind of see what took place there. So he sends the treasures up to Ben-Hadad, and then he attacks Israel. Baasha retreats, and then he's able to build up his own cities with it, and there's where he was building up his own cities at. Okay, so the important line of defense here for Asa against in his defense for Israel. Okay, so you can kind of see where all this is taking place at. So that's the plan. Plans worked out well. Then we get to verse 7. Okay, and God has a rebuke of Asa in his plan. Verse 7 first. And at the time that Hananiah, the seer, came to Asa, king of Judah, and said unto him, because thou hast relied on the king of Syria, and not relied on the Lord thy God, therefore is the host of the king of Syria escaped out of thine hand. Were not the Ethiopians and the Lubim a huge host with very many chariots and horsemen? Yet because thou didst rely on the Lord, he delivered them into thine hand. For the eyes of the Lord run to and fro throughout the whole earth, to show himself strong in the behalf of them whose heart is perfect toward him. To rebuke Asa because of his dealings with the northern kingdom. And he sends down the prophet, as we saw, Hananiah, Asa for failing to rest and failing to rely on the Lord. And just remind him that Asa, it wasn't that long ago that the Ethiopians were here. Their kingdom was greater. Their armies were but there was a very foolish change of heart that happened. That because of his foolishness, because of his foolish dealings with the northern kingdoms, that there was going to be some oil in some wars that were going to take place. 2 Chronicles. Where does or what the figure of speech that's used in verse 9 tell you about the importance God places on a perfect or loyal heart? Let's read it again. For the eyes of the Lord run to and fro throughout the earth to show himself strong in the behalf of them on the behalf of them whose heart is perfect towards him. Herein thou hast done foolishly, therefore from henceforth thou shalt have wars. What importance does God place on a perfect and loyal heart? What importance does God put on that? What importance does God put on a perfect, loyal heart? Primary importance. And so far that Hananiah said that God's eyes does what? Verse 9. What did God's eyes do? To and fro the entire world, right? Importance on peering where? Into the heart. Great is more importance on peering into the heart and showing him that there's great foolishness taking place when putting reliance in himself instead of to God. We get to verse 10 13. Now we see that Asa has a response. So we see Asa's mistake. Then Asa was wroth with the seer and put him in a prison house, for he was in a rage with him because of this thing. And Asa oppressed some of the people the same time. So instead of Asa listening to the prophet, listening to the word of the Lord, and understanding his mistake, we see Asa's response is what? Throws the old boy in jail, right? Because he came and told him this. And if we really were able to look at Asa's heart, we probably would see that Asa was what? After he heard this, he was probably what? Probably convicted. Right? He was probably convicted because he understood what was kind of where he was at. But he had too much pride in himself and pride in the decision that how it had worked out in his favor that he took the prophet here, the seer, and threw him in jail. It was mad because of the rebuke that he had gotten from the Lord. Verse 11, behold, the acts of Asa, first and last, lo, they are written in the book of Kings of Judah and Israel. And Asa, in the 39th year of his reign, was diseased in his feet until his disease was exceedingly great. Yet in his disease he sought not the Lord, but to the physicians. And Asa slept with his fathers and died in 1 year and 40th year of his reign. His own sepulchre, which he had made for himself in the city of David, and laid him in the bed which was filled with sweet odors and divers kinds of spices, and prepared by the apothecary's art. And they made a very great burning for him. So the agitation here. Conditions and stuff that he had around. That does not mean that we shouldn't go to the doctor, right? That not kind to Judah, was eventually marred with his disloyalty towards God near the end of his life. We saw and know his influence continued to kind of reverberate throughout Israel and die, as we saw in verse 15. Now let's go over King. Now, all that was happening as well. So back to 1 Kings with me, please. And we're going to go to chapter 15. So we saw what was going on in the southern kingdom. Let's go see what was. We have a little bit of an idea, but see exactly what was going on. The kingdom of Israel and the consistent heart that they have. And again, we're going to see here Baasha, who we had a little bit of talking to. I saw a little bit there in 1 King or in 2 Chronicles, and some of the loyalties that he had to the king that was before him. Look at verse 33 of chapter 15. 6 kings here of Israel are going to be mentioned in chapters 15 and chapter 16. During the 41-year reign in Judah, Asa saw into the throne in Israel. We had Nadab, the son of Jeroboam, was there only briefly, and he was eventually, his throne was cut short by Baasha of Issachar, who was the king that we saw and that we're going to see kind of here in the first or the last part of chapter 15. Now, this is the second dynasty of kings from the northern kingdom. Okay, this is the second dynasty. So Jeroboam and Nadab would have been the first. Baasha overthrew that family, overthrew that royal reign, and set up his own king and his own throne as well. And that's kind of as we can see the dynasties that were going on. And if we know, we go back to the beginning of this split. Okay, as we first started talking about this 4 or 5 weeks ago, there was a promise given to the northern kingdom as well as the southern kingdom, right? The northern kingdom was told that the line was eventually going to stop, right? There would be kings there would be people that ruled, but God would not the nation of Israel, his chosen people, through that king, through that northern kingdom. That the light that we see, the overarching theme of all of this is that light that was there, of course, was going to come through David's dynasty in the southern kingdom of Judah. Okay, so we know, being able to see the end result of this, because of the error of all these kings' ways, that's why we're going to continue to see these lines and new dynasty and these people dying all the time, because they at the beginning wouldn't follow and wouldn't show the loyalty to God in the same thing as they kind of continue to move through 1 Kings. We're going to see the same stuff kind of happening as well. Verse 33, in the third year of Asa, a king of Judah, began Baasha, the son of Ahijah, his reign over Israel in Tisra. 24 years was his reign. And he did evil in the sight of the Lord and walked in the way of Jeroboam. And in his sin wherewith he made Israel to sin as well. Then the word of the Lord came unto Jehu, the son of Hananiah, against Baasha, saying this, For as much as I exalted thee out of the dust, and made thee prince over my people Israel, and thou hast walked away in the way of Jeroboam, and hast made my people of Israel to sin, to provoke me to anger with their sins. Behold, I will take away the posterity of Baasha and the posterity of his house, and will make thy house like the house of Jeroboam the son of Nebat. Him that dieth of Baasha in the city shall the dogs eat, and him that dieth of his in the fields shall the fowls of the air eat. Now the rest of the acts of Baasha, and what he did in his might, are they not written in the book of Chronicles of the king of Israel? So Baasha slept with his fathers and was buried in Tisra, and Elah his son reigned in his stead. And also by the hand of the prophet Jehu, the son of Hananiah, came the word of the Lord against Baasha and against the house, even for all the evil that he did in the sight of the Lord, and provoking him to anger with the work of his hands, and being like the house of Jeroboam, and because he killed him. Okay, so we see this dynasty that was set up Hananiah, who talked to Asa, his son, came and talked to these kings and told them that because of their disloyalty to God, because of the evil that happened and that took place, and because of the turning of the people of Israel astray because of their evil, that line again would also die. And it went as far to tell what exactly was going to happen to those bodies. Right, the dogs are going to eat them when they died and laid in the streets. They died out in the fields. The crows and the buzzards are going to come in and eat them as well. And that was judgment, essentially. What God was doing was pouring out the impending judgment that was going to happen to Baasha because of his evil leadership. Now, the record of Baasha's death includes a re-emphasis on the reasons for the judgment. As we saw verses 5, 6, and 7. Because of the evil, because of the disloyalty, because of the fact they're turning people away from God, is why they're having the judgment that takes place on them and their families. All right? And so that ends, it is the beginning of the end of that dynasty as well. We get to verse 8 and down through 14. This is where we'll finish up today. Well, the other couple ones. Again, more of essentially kind of the same stuff that's going on. All right? If we look at verse 8, we get in the 26th year of Asa. So this is still going on. 6 kings he saw, so still going on during this time. Years. And like his father, he modeled his rule, modeled his religion, just like Jeroboam. Look at verse 13. For all the sins of Baasha and the sins of Elah his son, by which they sinned, and by which they made Israel to sin, in provoking the Lord of God to anger with their vanities. Now the rest of the acts of Elah and all that he did, are they not written in the book of Chronicles of the king of Israel? So we see, again, the exact same, this circle, the same thing that's happening. He modeled his religion, or modeled his ruling after Jeroboam, and because of that, we eventually see that he died and was killed, and his household was destroyed because of it. All right, in verse 15 down through verse 20, we see the next king, a king in 1885, who is Zimri. All right, so now we've seen Baasha, we've seen Elah, we've seen Zimri. And again, we see more of the same in verses 15 through 20. We see his loyalty to Jeroboam and what happened because of this. Something interesting that I want you to see, though, here in verse 15. In the 27th year of Asa, the king of Judah, did Zimri reign. And how long did Zimri reign for? 7 days. Zimri reigned for 7 days. So it lasted just 7 days before word spread of his treason against Elah, the previous king. And they came in and took him out because of his treason against him. And then now we've got the army in charge of the northern kingdom, and the army names Omri as their next king, as we see in verse 16. The people that were encamped heard Zimri hath conspired and slain the king, and all of Israel made Omri the captain of the host. So Omri was the guy in charge of the army, and he became king over Israel on that day. Okay, so then we get to Omri, and his story is in verses 21 through 28. And as we finish up the rest of the chapter here, we also see that Omri, not loyal to God, but loyal to Jeroboam as well. In verses 21 through 25, we don't have time to read them, but it shows that Omri's supporters, okay, the people who put him in charge, battled against a group of people that wanted to make he prevailed only to become worse than all of the kings that were before him. If you look at verse 25, But Omri wrought evil in the eyes of the Lord, and says that he did worse than all of them that were before him. Okay, so he walked in the ways of Jeroboam, and he was on the throne for 12 years. And then eventually, Omri brings us to an individual that we probably know, is that Omri then brings us to King Ahab. Okay? And we all probably recognize the name King Ahab. And as we get into next week, we're going to look at God versus Baal. And we know the story of King Ahab and Jezebel and kind of all the stuff that we're going to take the next couple of weeks to look at. All right, so that brings us to the end of this. So we've seen kind of the very quick digression of the northern kingdoms, and that is a direct correlation because of their disloyalty to God. All right, and while it was good for a time in Judah, and eventually, good for a time, and it goes bad, and we kind of finish up with this little graphic that they have for us, and we'll go back to this a couple times because they refer to this as the heart question. And the heart question says, are you with God to do His will, or do you expect God to be with you to do your will? Okay, and then we have this constant struggle, loyalty to God, loyalty to sin. If we are to do His will for our lives, seeking God that's going to be successful, like Asa was. If we change, though, and become loyal to ourselves, kind of like Asa was, we're forsaking God, we're going to see that a lot more problems are going to... that doesn't mean our body's going to get eaten by dogs and crows and things, but there's going to be some problems that we're going to have to God. We can find ourselves more. God does not mean that everything is always going to be. We're all very well aware of that. Constant reminder to you that is too, because sometimes we get difficult situations. Satan brings a little doubt into our lives, and he's a sly devil, right? He's a trickster. He can find ways to get in there and cause our confidence in God to fail. It's not always going to be sunshine and roses, but we do know that the payoff, right, the end result of loyalty to God is much greater than any dark time we can have here. Okay, so we should be deepening our loyalty to God. Next week, we get into God's voice versus Baal's voice, and some of the things that were going on. King Ahab and Elijah and all that very interesting story, famous story that we know well, that we're going to get into next week. Let's pray. Dear Heavenly Father, thank you for the lesson that we have here with Asa and how things were good for a while, and how you were loyal to him because of his loyalty, and then how he turned his back on you, and then because of that, it was just a digression of his life and his kingdom because of the Lord. And it's the same promise that we have in our lives as well. Loyalty to you will in turn receive loyalty from you, Lord. And the moment we try to become loyal to self, Lord, there's going to be a lot of problems and tribulations and things are going to happen to us, Lord, as you're going to try to get us back to you. And Lord, and we're thankful for the lessons of the Old Testament and how you are a God of love, you are a God of compassion, but you also, Lord, are a God of wrath and a God of judgment of sin. And if those things are present in our lives, Lord, you have to judge them, you have to purge them, you have to find ways in which we get rid of those things, Lord, so that we can be better and more effective in our service of you, Lord. So we thank you for that as well. We don't always like the whippings, we don't always like the chastisement, Lord. It hurts, Lord, but we as Christians should be thankful for it because it shows us just how much you love us. I want to pray for Pastor Rob as he comes in the next hour as well, Lord, and the people that will be coming in for the afternoon service, Lord, that you'll just use him in a mighty way, Lord, to keep us attentive, listening to the word, Lord, not just with our ears, Lord, so we can take an